thing I'm gonna ask you is to say your full name and to spell it, because I'll need that when I put your name underneath it.
Okay, and the name, my name is, I go by Bud Orr, but my name is Cyril Orr.
Okay. What would you rather have underneath your name on the video?
Well, I think probably Cyril Orr, because that would tie into the Ball Mountain Cemetery, and I'm a junior, so
Okay.
my father's buried, and so, from accuracy point of view, that probably, makes more sense.
Okay.
And I'm not uncomfortable with that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So why don't you just go ahead and while you're talking, just stay focused here. I'm just going to see how you look on there. And go ahead and spell your name fully.
Okay, my name is Cyril Colton Orr Jr., spelled Cyril, Colton, Colton, and Orr is spelled Orr.
Okay, good. All right, I'm going to have you look more this way with me. That's better. Okay, now just look like you're right looking at me.
Okay.
And, okay, good. Okay. So, Bud, why don't you tell me your date of birth?
I was born September 3rd, 1943.
And when did you move to Gilpin County?
Well, the family history goes back, and I'll go through some of that. It goes back to the 1870s. And to give a little background, my great-grandfather, Henry Richards, and his wife Rebecca, and their two small sons, Henry and James, migrated from Cornwall, from St. Just, Cornwall. Henry was a skilled timberman in the mines. He wasn't a miner, he was a timberman. He was in a skilled position. They left Cornwall and moved to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and where there's it's called copper country, and it was the copper mines, and he had come from the tin mining in Cornwall and moved there, and it's sometime Jim was born in 1872, so after that, because my grandmother Edith was born in 1876 in Copper Falls, Michigan. They were there, and they left Copper Falls, or Copper Country, sometime after she was born, and arrived in Nevadaville in Gilpin County in 1879. And Henry went to work in the mines here. One mine they talk about a lot that he worked at was the California mine, which is in Nevadaville, or up on the side of Quartz Hill in Nevadaville. And they first lived in a log cabin, and two daughters were born. Maud and Melissa were born in Nevadaville. In 1885, Henry built a house for the family. And it stands today in Nevadaville on Main Street to the southwest, as Main Street goes towards the southwest from the downtown area. The house stands today. It's a small wooden structure that he built in 1885. So that's really the origin of the family going back several generations. The family names, which is of note, are Hicks, because Rebecca's maiden name was Hicks, Richards, then James, and then Orr. And I'm of that fourth generation. I actually personally never lived in Gilpin County, but I grew up in Idaho Springs in Clear Creek County. And because the family has been over that many years, has been so centered around Nevadaville, and in particular the Ball Mountain Cemetery, I know a lot about Gilpin County. I also worked here for the Forest Service. So I worked at Coal Springs Campground down the road, maintaining and doing maintenance and construction and so forth during my college years. So we did a lot of fencing and worked up around American City above Apex and did fencing work. and did for the Forest Service, for the government during the summer. So, although not living here and so forth, I'm very familiar with the two counties, both Gilpin County and Clear Creek County. But the family, after 1885, the 5 children, there were 5 Richards children, and they grew up in that house that Henry built in 1885. It's so that as a landmark, because there are no addresses, it's on Main Street, and it's a wooden structure. It's on the uphill side. It's adjacent almost to the Pozo mine, which sits down in the gully, and it's got a kind of a simulated brick tar paper cover on it that's been there since I was familiar with it. My first memories of Nevadaville and Gilpin County were after World War II, because the family would often gather for picnics and so forth, and the siblings, my mother's siblings that had moved to Denver, would come up and they would have big picnics on Decoration Day and Memorial Day and so forth. So although they were, I think, happy to get the opportunity to move to Denver and grow up down there where the opportunities were, they missed Nevadaville and Gilpin County and so forth. But my grandmother Edith was as I mentioned, born in Michigan and came to Nevadaville when she was 3 years old. She grew up in Nevadaville and went to school in the school there, as did all of the children. Both generations went to the Nevadaville school. And in that second generation, the oldest daughter was named Cora, and Solomon James, my grandfather, he came in a parallel path, but also came from Cornwall. And he was a miner. He was a young man and a miner, and actually worked in the drilling and the shooting and the mucking and the real hard labor. And they were married. Edith and Solomon were married in 1896 in the Methodist Church in Nevadaville, and he, as happened often with miners, he came as a young man, as somewhere in his early 20s, came to Gilpin County in Nevadaville and worked in the mines and contracted silicosis. And died at the age of 38, and left 5 children. And this presented a very difficult but typical story for families, because at the time the rock drills had only compressed air that forced the action of the drill bit. And at a later point in time, they invented a drill that had a parallel water line, and it tended to cut down the dust. And it did help, but miners still contracted silicosis, which is, it fills the pores in the lungs, and eventually they aren't able to breathe. And he was 38 years old. Now his brother, Thomas Henry James, who came to this country along with their father, the 3 of them left England and left great-grandmother over in England. And the father, named Tommy, that's all we know him by, was Tommy. He left Gilpin County and went on to California and was never heard of again. But Solomon and Thomas Henry stayed there, and tragically they married and had children and so forth. And as I said, Solomon died at age 38, and Thomas Henry died at age 41. And in both cases left widows with children. Now, what my grandmother Edith did was to go to work, and she was what she did was as a practical nurse and a midwife. And I have oral histories that I've brought that say that she, over the period of time that she did the midwife thing, she delivered over 300 babies. Now, we don't have any documentation to that effect, But as many children as were born, it might not be hard to believe. But at the same time, she took care of sick people. And what happened then, the children aged at the time that Solomon died, age 13, and my mother was a month old, a brand new baby. So Cora, the oldest sister, who was 13 at the time, ended up raising the rest of the kids because her mother, Edith, would go and have to tend to people, and oftentimes this care required that she stay, and these kids were left basically on their own with Cora in charge. But Cora was 13, and the next sibling was Redvers. He was 2 years younger than that, and then a son named Theodore, or Ted, and Edna May, and then my mother. And there were 2 children that died, Solomon and Bertha, and they during that. So it was she had a brood of 5 children to take care of, and they actually. My impression is that they actually lived somewhat of a middle class existence in terms of, because they were so well established as a family. My grandmother Edith also was the town clerk for Nevadaville. We have a copy of a letterhead from the town of Nevadaville with her, Edith James, treasurer and recorder, and she did that. She was head of the Republican Party. She was on the church board and the school board. So Edith was a very dynamic, I think, woman. I never knew her. She died the year I was born, but the other circumstance that put her in the position she was in is that in 1896, Rebecca Hicks, Hicks Richards, passed away. We don't know how. She was in her 40s and died, and that left Henry. But at that point in time, in 96, Edith was 20 years old, and she became the head of the family, the matriarch of the family. So they had 2 younger daughters who were teenagers, Maud and Melissa Richards, still there. So I think that those circumstances caused Edith to become a very strong willed, a very dynamic and resourceful person. And so the way the family lived was, of course, with Edith being away but making a living. The kids grew up as kind of a unit. Now Ted, they had the opportunity for him through the church to go to Clayton College in Denver, and it was kind of a good and bad situation. The good was that it was one less mouth to feed and take care of in Nevadaville. The difficult part of it was that he Edith had to literally sign over custody to the child, and he was 10 years old. And that was the rules of Clayton College, and it's in Denver, north of City Park is where it is, and it was set up through the estate of a man named Clayton, and the intent was boys who'd lost their fathers to train them and give them an education, and he got a good education. He became a carpenter. He was an expert woodworker, but he was apart from the family, and it made it very difficult. I think it was a difficult, probably very strict environment, and I'm sure he missed the family, and he missed living in Nevadaville. But as a result of that, he did get a trade and a good thing. But in the meantime, the other siblings are all growing up in Nevadaville, and the Redvers, the school at the time went to the 8th grade. There was no high school. So they all graduated from 8th grade, and except my mother. She was young enough when they moved that she ended up going to the Denver schools. But as soon as Redvers, the oldest brother, graduated from 8th grade, he went to work. He had a donkey named Prince, and he pulled a two-wheel cart, and he hauled water from the spring, which is up Main Street, up at the top of the hill above Nevadaville. There was no water system and no sewer system in Nevadaville. Everybody had outhouses, and he, for 25 cents a barrel, he would haul water to the residences, to people. And at age 13, that's what he did. Now, in the meantime, while Edith was away working at these jobs as the midwife and delivering babies and so forth, there was a neighbor named Robert Combs, and he was an older gentleman. He had come to Colorado before the railroad was here. We don't know exactly when. He was an elderly man, and he was a merchant of some kind that brought merchandise in from Ohio. And the story goes that Robert Combs, he was the next door neighbor to the James family, and the story goes that he came to Colorado by himself and brought merchandise and to get established and so forth, and then returned to Ohio to a woman or a girl that with the intention that they would be married, and it turned out she had in the meantime married someone else. So he came back to Nevadaville and lived the life of a bachelor. But the point of Mr. Combs, it's an interesting connection, because while Edith was gone tending to her midwifery and so forth, Mr. Combs would kind of look over the kids and make sure that they were all right. And he was, when Solomon died in 1908, Edith bought a plot in Bald Mountain Cemetery for the family. And sometime after that, I don't know when, the stone says it, but Mr. Combs passed away, and they buried him in the James plot. So that was a gesture of, appreciation and so forth. But everyone in that generation talked very fondly of Mr. Combs, and we have pictures of Mr. Combs and my mother at age 2, something like that. And the pictures are kind of interesting in that one goes back to Edith when she was a child, and we're guessing maybe 5, 6, 7 years old, which would have put it in the mid-'80s. But it's a studio picture, so it was probably taken in Central City, and of her. And then we've got a series of pictures after that. But we have no pictures of Rebecca. We do have pictures of Henry. But about that time is when photographic studios were coming in, and that was the thing. And I'm sure that they regretted not having a picture of Rebecca, but in all the family, we have no picture of him. So let me think, the next thing in terms of the history of the family, as I said, Edith was very, very active in civic affairs, and she was very prominent, actually, in the little town and well known. And she, as those children began to grow, and particularly Cora, I think, Solomon passed away in 1908. But they stayed in Nevadaville until 1917, and at that point, Cora was just 21, I think, and the Redwoods was like 19, and they were really ready to go somewhere and become adults and so forth. So she moved the family to Denver, and they settled in North Denver in the Highlands neighborhood, along with a lot of other Cornish people. And Edith went to work for a doctor named Asquith, who had been a physician in Nevadaville, who she had worked with before. And so she went down there and worked with Dr. Asquith, doing the same thing, midwifery and so forth. So that's the time as far as a full-time for the James family. Now the Bennett family, which was, if you go back another generation to Edith's generation, her sister Melissa married a man named Fred Bennett. And the Bennett family stayed in Nevadaville until 1923. So they were there quite a bit longer. But then eventually they moved to Denver also and lived in North Denver. And, in the meantime, Maud, one of the younger sisters, somehow got nursing training. We've got a picture of her in her nurse's cadet or student uniform, and she ended up traveling the world. Henry, I think after Rebecca passed away, probably for whatever reason wanted to get away or whatever, he went and worked in South America in the mines for a short while, but then came back. And in the meantime, Maud went to South America with him and met her husband down there, Bert Green. He was a mining engineer, and they eventually settled in New Mexico. But slowly, one by one, the family, about that time, in that period of time from 1915 to the 1920s, they left Nevadaville. There's another branch of the family named Hicks, and Philip Hicks is buried in Nevadaville, and he was Rebecca's brother, so he was first generation. And there's a whole branch of the family, and my mother had a number of cousins in that Hicks branch of the family that I never became acquainted with. We were close to the Bennetts, and we were close to the Greens, and we were close to the rest of the James family. But as time progressed, another sidelight after the Bennetts had moved to Denver from Nevadaville. In the 30s, President Roosevelt raised the price of gold that the government would pay for gold from $17 an ounce to $35 an ounce. And so Fred Bennett, and this was maybe not a scandal, but it caused disruption. He had, as a lot of those men in that era had, he had the gold fever, and he left during the Depression. He left a good job at the railroad and came back to Nevadaville, brought one of his sons, James Eldred, with him, and they attempted to gold mine again. Because, and it was a stimulus of sorts at the time that Roosevelt put in to promote mining. As a kind of a parallel story, that's how my father, Cyril Orr Sr., got involved in mining. He was working in Denver at the Denver Union Stockyards. And I don't know where they got the idea, but he and some friends decided to come to Idaho Springs and look into gold mining. Again, I believe because of the raise in the price of gold, and people that I know that I grew up with that lived in Idaho Springs in the 1930s said that it created a bit of a boom into the economy there. But anyway, that's how my father got started in gold mining, and they opened and discovered, and it was an existing mine called the Dixie Mine, but they hit it very well in the late 30s, and really did make some pretty good money. And in the meantime, in 1940, my parents met and were married in 1940. And ironically, Alma came after being in Nevadaville and growing up to age 8 and going to Denver. She came back to a mining town and a mining life, and he was in that mining operation until the late 50s, so that's really. I was actually born during the World War II in Oakland, California. The War Production Board had shut down gold mining as a non-essential industry. So my father packed up the family and went to California. He worked in the shipyards, building, I think, a Kaiser shipyard. And just in terms of having work, well, after I was born, the family came back and settled back in Idaho Springs. And so, as I said, he and his partners were in that mining operation until 1957, I believe. And so that's our our background, the rest of the family, except for Fred Bennett's trip back up to temporarily try to hit gold. So we actually have 4 generations or 3 generations of people in the family that have been involved in gold mining in Colorado. My dad told me go to college, and get a job. He didn't say don't go into mining, but it was kind of an understanding that I wanted to do something else. The other aspect that might be of interest is the Bald Mountain Cemetery, being the cemetery for Nevadaville. I think it was established in 1870. I'm not sure where they buried people between the town was established in 1861-62, and then it was incorporated in 1870, and that's when they opened the cemetery, the Bald Mountain Cemetery. And we've got a receipt from Henry Richards when he bought the Richards family plot in the cemetery, and it was for $4. Yeah, and I think the way the receipt reads is room enough for 8 bodies. Was the description on the receipt, and interestingly enough, my mother passed away. And tragically, my mother passed away at a young age of 54 in Idaho Springs, and so the thought was that she'd like to be buried in Bald Mountain, and so in 1962, she was 54 years old, and she passed away from asthma. And but we bought a plot near the Richards James plots, and the price had gone up to $20 by 1962. So, but I've written, my sister Susan and I have written a book, and I brought it to contribute to the Historical Society on Alma, my mother's life, and Cyril Sr. or Bud. He was Bud also, and also there's a section that we wrote on the Bald Mountain Cemetery, and we photographed each stone of families that we family members, and then tried to whatever photographs we had or whatever stories we had of the associated with the graves. And one story, Thomas Henry James, that would be my great uncle and Solomon's brother, married a woman named Dora, and they had daughters. They had one daughter, Etta, E-T-A was the name. And somehow, I don't know that anybody knows how it happened, but the kids were playing in the yard, and she was 2 years old, and a water barrel got away and rolled over her, and she died. And she's buried in with the rest of that part of the James family in Bald Mountain Cemetery. Otherwise, there were people. I mean, the normal lifespans and so forth. But in the cemetery, we do have 4 generations. We have the original Hicks Richards generation, followed by the James Bennett Green generation, and then followed by my parents, which in our case is would be the Orr generation of our family. And so we're all in one section of the cemetery down on the north end. That I can't think of a whole lot more that might be germane to the family history, except the kids growing up of that James generation and the hardships that they went through and so forth.
Well, I want to ask you how, from your perspective, how much Nevadaville changed from when you first started, because you would go up there quite a bit.
In the 40s, yes, yeah.
And how it evolved and how it changed to what it is now.
Well, I think that is an interesting question because it was quite the boomtown at one time, and I've read in the R.L. Brown book on Gilpin County that the population of Nevadaville at one time rivaled that of Denver. And I've seen all kinds of estimates of several thousand people in Nevadaville. And we do have some pictures. I think it's Sanborn that used to take the insurance pictures of communities, and we've got them. And one picture is very interesting. It's I think in the 70s, and there's a lot of houses. And then there's another picture in the 90s, and there's fewer houses. And part of what happened in Nevadaville, there were several disastrous fires. I do know that. And so they lost houses in that. And at the same time, the mining boom probably peaked, my impression is in the 70s and maybe the 80s. And then by the 90s and into the teens, and by the teens, after the turn of the century, it was definitely on the decline. And families were moving out. You hear stories about the families would just leave the house and their belongings in it, and they would go to Idaho Springs or go to Leadville or to Cripple Creek and places like that where there was possible employment with the intent of coming back to Nevadaville. It never came back. And my cousins, who are mostly all older than me, talk about going up there as children, and you could go in a house and there would be dishes in the cupboard and clothes in the closet. And it was just a matter of them going and either not being able to come back or choosing not to come back. Now, the other thing that did occur, one thing that when Edith moved her family to Denver from Nevadaville in 1917, she transferred the deed of the house. Her father, Henry, had transferred the deed in 1896 after Rebecca died. She owned the house until 1917, and she turned it over for $1.50 to make it a legal transfer of the deed. And the other thing that we know happened was that during the Depression, people were out of work, and they would come up there and tear the houses down and sell the lumber, take the lumber to Denver and sell it. So that's part of what, in the change of Nevadaville, the history of it, it went through that boom, and I think was a very stable community, family-oriented community, and so forth. But as the mining declined, then it began its decline. And I think by the 1920s, it was, it had become very low in population. I don't know that at that point it was a ghost town. But now my memory of it, say another 20 years later, after World War II, was surprisingly, appearance-wise, very much the same as it is today. As I say, the Richards James House, it's been preserved. A family in Lakewood, last we knew, owned it and used it as a weekend retreat. And I don't know why that house, if you look at some of the pictures, there were houses just everywhere along the streets, and there were several streets deep. And that house survived, and nobody has any idea, along with less than 10 houses in town. And of course the main street is quite famous. The jail is there, and that's where Edith worked as the city clerk, and the Masonic Hall. I do know that one of the there were supposed to be 13 saloons in Nevadaville, and my uncle in Redvers, in his biograph, mentions that. So, and I've heard that before. So I don't know how factual that count is, but there were a number of saloons. But it was still a family where I understand, and I've read, I think in the R.L. Brown book, there was no red light district at all in Nevadaville. It just wasn't allowed. And but that's the change. Now what I see now, of course, with property and the interest of in real estate in Gilpin County and so forth, the whole gulch for quite a ways was private ground, was platted as private ground, and not the government mining claims and so forth. So it became private ground. The Forest Service doesn't start till you get way up by, right on the edge of Ball Mountain. That's Forest Service. And I worked up there on some fencing and so forth. So I'm familiar with where the public land is. The rest was all private ground. And what I've noticed is in perhaps it's the gambling in Gilpin County or whatever. The interest in Gilpin County real estate, of course, is like a lot of places, has gone way up. And I notice a lot more fencing. I have a story to tell about Redvers, the oldest James boy. He in the glory hole. And if you leave the James house and you go across by the Pozo mine and up the grade on Quartz Hill, you're at the glory hole. And he was up there, and they used to go up there just for fun. And he was, I don't know if he was driving his car or he was walking, but my cousin Elaine was with him. And they were heading up to the glory hole to look, just to look at it and so forth. And somebody confronted them and said, "Hey, this is private ground. You can't go in here." And incensed my uncle because I've been doing this since, I was born here in 1896, and I've been walking all over here and everything. So that is one change that I see. And there's a lot more fencing. Now they've also gone in there and done improvements to the drainage and so forth. So that's a big change. But it's surprising. Very little has been built. The Masons, of course, have done an admirable job of maintaining that city block. Oh, that's another thing that's worth mentioning. The recreation at the time, for the women, everything was centered around the Methodist Church, or not the Methodist Church. They had two churches, the Methodist Church and the Episcopal Church. But woman's life was centered around, of course, their children and the church. Men's life, there were the saloons, but there were also a number of fraternal organizations. And both Henry and Solomon were members of the Knights of Pythias and the Red Men. And each of those lodges had buildings in the downtown part of Nevadaville where they would lease the lower store to a merchant and had their lodge hall upstairs. And that's the way the Masonic lodge is configured. They have the lodge room upstairs, and the lower was a commercial space. But we have a picture of Solomon in his garb of the Red Men, and you think, here we are 100 plus years later. It's not terribly politically correct in today's term, because they've got this Indian garb on, and it might be a little offensive, but that was the name of the lodge. But that's the biggest thing. Now, of course, the other thing is the forestation. That's changed as a natural thing, because when those mining camps were first established, they cut the wood down, maybe to burn it, or maybe to use as timber, or maybe to build log houses. And you look at early day pictures, and the hills Bald Mountain is bald. I mean, it literally is. Now you go up there today, and the trees have grown back so much that the views are actually obscured in some ways where they weren't before. And so that's another, I think, big change that's occurred.
What do you think about how things have changed in relationship to Central City and Nevadaville with the gambling and how all that came about?
Well, I don't really know, except my impression is that Nevadaville is probably falls into the same kind of category that maybe Apex does and Russell Gulch and the other towns. Maybe Russell Gulch a little less because there seem to be more people there. In that so few people lived up there that I don't think, frankly, I don't think it's had that much effect. Now, of course, it's had its ups and downs in Central City, and Blackhawk is just incredible in terms of what's happened there. But if you look at Central City, somewhat on the positive side, they took a lot of old buildings that were very unstable and unworthy of use, and stabilized them and made them viable in terms of structures. And I think the gambling, good or bad or whatever, I wouldn't, as someone who's familiar with the history, I would not necessarily have been in favor of it. But otherwise, I'm not sure in the case of Nevadaville, or if you take Apex, those little towns, American City, of course, was very small, but Russell Gulch appears to me like maybe a few people have moved in there, but it certainly has not had the effect on those little ancillary towns that it had on both Central City and Blackhawk.
I got to actually walk through. There's a gentleman in town named Eric Miller.
Okay.
And he likes to go up through Nevadaville and up. Is it? How do you say it? It's the Prizzy mine. Prizzy mine.
Well, my understanding was it was called the Pozo.
Okay.
Now the Boodle mine is down further on the flats above Central City, where all the cemeteries are.
Right.
And that junction of the road one goes to Apex, one goes to the Columbine Campground, another one you can go up to the Frizzy Ranch and then get up to Nevadaville. That was the Boodle mine. But my understanding, and I'm not absolutely confident in this, our family has always referred to that as the Pozo.
Okay. Well, I've got pictures of it because we were on foot and no one gave us any issues.
Yeah.
And we went past there and there's a wooden house that's falling in.
Uh-huh.
But I got really cool pictures of that, and we walked all the way back to the Glory Hall.
Okay.
So I got to see some of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, and they fenced some of it, and I think they put signs up and indicated this is private ground, and so forth and so on. But when I was a kid, we didn't go that way from Nevadaville to the Glory Hole. We would go around by the chain of mines above Central City on the road to Virginia Canyon and Idaho Springs, and there was a road, but that's been since blocked off. We have walked as a family. We've hiked up there, and I was a little disappointed in that. And the Glory Hole used to be, it was just a frightening thing, and because it was sheer cliffs. And I was up there, I don't know, it's been a few years ago, but they had built a road down in there because apparently somebody was going to do some mining or something. And it kind of ruined the scary effect of the whole thing. Oh, as a kid, I was afraid of getting too close to it. But that's an interesting story, the whole Glory Hole chain of mines and so forth. But didn't really have that much effect on Nevadaville, I don't think. It certainly, in the 30s, had a huge effect on Central City. But it's an interesting story, it really is.
Do you have any history on the stone house when you come right in? That little stone house on the left?
They call that Dogtown. They called that Dogtown down in that region. And what I've heard, I can't say that I know, except that I've heard these stories, is that the population of Nevadaville was primarily Cornish and Irish, and they didn't get along very well anyway. The Germans and the Italians, it was sort of segregated, lived in Dogtown, down in that lower, where the stone house is. I don't know the particular history of that, but I do know that that was called Dogtown, and I've read that that's where an interesting story, I think it was in the Brown book on Gilpin County, it said the Irish and the Cornish would fight anyway. They'd be in the saloons and, young men and so forth, and they had rivalries and so forth, until the Chinese, the Italians, and the Germans showed up. And then they band together to fight the other groups. But that's those things that you hear, those stories. Yeah.
Well, the family that owns that stone house now had told me that originally monks were in there. The Chinese monks that were in there from the railroads, working on the railroads.
And that could be there was some Chinese labor, and probably because as a result of the railroad came into Central City in the 70s, I believe 73 plus, right, 1873, right in there. So and they were notorious for using Chinese labor, of course, and now up in Nevadaville there was something called the Gilpin Tram, and we just got a book, just a wonderful book on the history of the Gilpin Tram, and it lays out right-of-ways and everything like that. It was not, they used a small narrow gauge track and small Shea engines, but they mainly, what it was to haul coal and timber to the mines, and then to take the ore and haul it back to the mills in Blackhawk. And so there was no railroad as such, and the only times that they hauled people on that Gilpin Tram was on excursion trains. Occasionally on holidays and stuff, they would have an excursion train.
Yeah, I had some gentlemen in here 2 sessions ago, because I think this is my 4th time here, and they all worked in the Glory Hole and the Golden Mine.
Mm-hmm.
And they were talking about such things that you were talking about with the ore and everything. And what was interesting about what this one gentleman said, his name is Boom Boom Don, or
Okay.
Don Boom Boom. Do you know who I'm talking
No.
about? Oh, well, he would set all the explosives.
Right.
And there was some crazy stuff going around, like in the 80s around here, where they killed 2 guys and put them down in a shaft in a vehicle.
I read about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's some crazy stuff that went around.
Well, there's always been, it's a mining culture, and both here in Clear County, and by and large, it's a blue collar type kind of culture, and always was. And dynamite, and it was I think the old saying about work hard and live hard and play hard, and no, even in Idaho Springs, there were incidents where there were. My Uncle Redward tells a story about a mystery in Nevadaville where there was a Chinese fella who was murdered, and they stuffed him in a big pickle barrel, and they found the barrel with him in it, but never solved the crime, so nobody knew what it was. But Redvers in his personal history mentions that.
Yeah, a lot of crazy things happen.
No, I think it was to a great extent, it was the Wild West.
Exactly.
It really was.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
It was a frontier, and the altercations about mining claims, and I heard a saying that there were 2 people. The miners never got rich, or very rarely got rich, but there were two professions that did. The merchants would oftentimes get rich, and most certainly the lawyers got rich because of the legal disputes. And if you look at a mining plat map, it's easy to understand how they just overlap and they're right adjacent to each other. Probably poorly surveyed, certainly poorly marked, and no, I think it was pretty wild. But everything you hear about Nevadaville was that was a very family oriented kind of a town.
That's good to know, because it just sounds like all the craziness was down in Central City with the prostitution and the guys getting off work, and haydaying down there. So
and I think all the bankers and the money and everything was in Central City. So all of that wheeling and dealing and financial aspects of it were where I think Nevadaville was more just the working person's town, is what it was.
Kind of the suburbs of the Central
somewhat,
City.
yeah, somewhat. And another interesting thing about my grandmother Edith, they had a donkey. They didn't have transportation. So now she wasn't an old woman. I mean, when they moved from up there, she was only 32 years old, but she walked everywhere. So every day she would walk from Nevadaville to Central City and back to work, if that's where the care was she was providing. Now, I don't know if she went to Russell Gulch. She walked to Russell Gulch, I assume. But she went around to the homes and tended to people. And we've got some pictures of my uncle when he was a teenager, and the pictures, he's on his burro, his donkey, and Prince, and he's in Idaho Springs, and we're all wondering, and it's a picture taken in a house that's there today that I've taken some then and now pictures, and there were kind of young girls there, so I'm sure the social attraction, but he rode that donkey to Idaho Springs, he and a couple of friends, I'm sure, just out on an adventure.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
I'm gonna check the time real quick,
Okay.
because I know I got another person coming in. And then I'm gonna have you give me your address and everything. When I do get all this put together,
Okay.
oh, we're good. I'm gonna make copies, so
Okay.
you'll have it. The problem is, the man who's got me doing this keeps on dragging it out and dragging it out and dragging it out.
Sure.
It's like I'm never gonna get done,
Yeah.
because I gotta edit everything.
Right.
So let me ask you about the Idaho Springs time. Do you have anything connection to the Argo mine or anything like that?
The business-wise, no. The Argo's an interesting history because the main beneficiaries of the Argo mine are the mines in Gilpin County. It served as a utility tunnel so that they could gravity mine, and rather than bring the ore to the surface, they could mine it down and let it go down and capture it in the tunnel and then take it to the Argo mill. And the other benefit, and a huge benefit, is a lot of the mines are wet, and there's underground springs and so forth. And when they drilled a shaft or whatever, it would fill up with water, and they were constantly having to pump the water. Well, the benefit of the Argo Tunnel is that it was down at an elevation lower than the mines, and the water ran out. Now, today, of course, it's a Superfund EPA site because of that. Those mines are still draining into the Argo, and they're processing and removing the heavy metals and so forth from it. But engineering and mining-wise, it was a huge enterprise. But now, no, my father wasn't involved in that, but there's amazing history, really. There was a tragic accident in the 40s where there was a crew of miners working in the Argo Tunnel, and they drilled into one of the wet mines, and it flooded and killed them all. And it so happens that one of the man's name is Albers. I don't think any connection to the Albers today in Clear Creek County, but he was a classmate of Cora's in Nevadaville. And, it's just a small town coincidence. But another story that you may have heard or somebody may have told, and this was repeated to me by a man that worked for my dad, who grew up in Idaho Springs, and it's in the R.O. Brown book, is there was a school teacher who lived in Idaho Springs, and she would actually commute to Nevadaville. She would ride the train that they had. They had a little tram, and they would take her in and then put her in the bucket or the hoist and hoist her up to the top of the mine. She would teach school in Nevadaville and then return back to Idaho Springs. And it sounds preposterous, but I've seen it, and Otto Carlson is the man that told me the story. Yeah, and so I believe it. But that, and then of course the Argo, it processed the mill. It had a mill and a processing there, and it had the railroad access and so forth. So, but no, my father's mining operation was in the Cascade District, which is more south towards, it's up Ute Creek towards Mount Evans. And they, as I said, they went up there in the 30s, a bunch of young guys, and got the idea after Roosevelt had raised the price of gold to go mining. And they were farm boys. They didn't know anything about it. They learned about mining, and it turned out they hit it very good before the war, before World War II, and actually made quite a bit of money. And as mining is, it's a boom and bust, or was a boom and bust thing. And in 1942, because of the manpower and the materials that were going into gold mining, it was called the War Production Board. They shut down gold mining in the country, and so that you could mine steel and things of that sort, and other metals that would contribute to the war effort, war materials. So without any way to make a living, I told the story. They moved to California. I was born out there, and then they came back, and they reopened in '45 after the war was over, and they hit it again. Very good, rich gold, a unique kind of a flake, wiry gold that they even made jewelry out of. The Dixie Gold jewelry is actually kind of a sought-after collectible, and then the post-war inflation. He told me that prior to World War II, they would pay a miner $5 a day, and they were getting $35 an ounce. And of course, prior to the war, the vein was richer and they were doing better. Well, after the war, post-war inflation, they were then having to pay $20 a day, but the government was still just paying $35 an ounce. So, and at the same time, the vein, the Dixie lode, wasn't as rich. And so the whole thing just kind of squeezed the profitability out of it, is what happened. And they sold out to a conglomerate, a man in Colorado Springs named E.W. Hayes, put together a corporation. He had a mining division, and so that Dixie mine became part of that. But no, my sister and I, we grew up there in Idaho Springs. Went through high school there, graduated from high school there, and our parents both died in 1962.
Quite a long time ago.
Yeah. Well, I'm 70. I'll be 75 in September. So
I was born in '62. That's why I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
So you do have plots available?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we do, and they're actually, nobody's going to dispute your claim, but there are, in terms of the plots in Bald Mountain, the first generation Philip Hicks is buried there in a plot. Henry and Rebecca Richards are adjacent to his plot. Then the James plot with Edith and Solomon, and as I mentioned, Robert Combs is buried in it. And we've interred the ashes of other generations of family. And then the Orr plot is would be to the east, I guess. So yeah, the answer is yeah, we've got a claim there.
The director of the museum would have loved to have talked to you a couple years ago, because we do the cemetery crawl every year,
Yeah.
and we did Bald Mountain.
I was there.
Oh, were you there?
I was there.
I was there too with the gentleman that was signing books. He wrote a book, and we were
Right.
sitting there. That's the
Right.
first time I was involved in that.
Yeah.
So.
No, my cousin Elaine James, Redford's daughter, and my family, we were there for that cemetery crawl. And I don't remember the gentleman's name. He was a teacher that portrayed Mr. Combs. And no, it was very interesting because we were able to have a discussion. And he had the picture that I mentioned of Mr. Combs and my mother as a 2-year-old as a record. But yeah, because even members of the family, we were at a interment for one of my cousins here a few years ago, and one of the younger generation said, "Well, who is this Mr. Combs?" And so we told the story of how he was nearly a family member.
That's very interesting. Very interesting. We haven't had anyone really talk about Nevadaville.
Really?
No.
Yeah. Well, my perspective on it, of course, is just my first memory is as a very young child after World War II. But as I said, the family would go up and maintain the cemetery plots, and my dad even later in his mining years had some interests in Gilpin County. None of it ever worked into a mining operation, but and then the other thing, of course, is another thing about the Redvers and the donkey cart. They if they could afford coal, they bought coal, but they needed wood for a coal and wood stove. And so he tells in his story about taking Prince the donkey, excuse me, and the two-wheel cart and going up to Pisgah Lake. And if you go from Nevadaville up to the cemetery and go on the road that parallels and continues west, you'll eventually come to a fork in the road. And if you go take the North Fork, you do end up at Pisgah Lake. So he used to take the donkey cart up there and cut wood and haul it home. And that's also the way from that point you can get down into York Gulch and Hamlin Gulch and down into Clerkett County. Because the county line runs on a ridge right up there between the two counties. Yeah. And I worked in all of that. Had some forest fires up there that we fought. And so I got a lot more familiar with Gilpin County through that, Yeah, so.
Very interesting. Yeah. Well, I appreciate all your stories, Bud.
Well, as you look in the book, and I have two oral histories that one by Cora, it's pretty extensive, and the other one by Redvers is a little bit more brief, but we were able to come up with more pictures on his, and I put the pictures into the text as he was talking, and then the other is the bound book is the history that Susan and I put together.